Hello and welcome, dear friends, colleagues, and postgraduate students. Welcome to the Religion Seminar, the official platform of the Humanities Religious Studies Research Collective for disseminating cutting-edge research in the study of religion. The seminar is based at the School of Humanities and Communication Arts at Western Sydney University. My name is Milad Milani, and our first speaker in the series for 2024 is my colleague and co-editor of the Journal for the Academic Study of Religion, Dr. Rosemary Hancock. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. I am on Darug land, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples present today. Rosie is a sociologist of religion and is Assistant Director of the Institute for Ethics and Society at the University of Notre Dame, Australia. She convenes the Institute's Religion, Culture and Society Research Focus Area. Rosemary's research explores the dynamics of religion and politics in contemporary society, with a particular focus on environmentalism and nature. Her first book, Islamic Environmentalism, Activism in the United States and Great Britain, was published by Routledge in 2018. And her research has appeared in journals such as CITY, Social Movement Studies, and Journal of Sociology. She is co-editor of the Journal of the Academic Study of Religion and co-hosts the popular sociology podcast, Uncommon Sense. Rosie will be speaking to us today about the apocalyptic future of the climate crisis that looms large in the cultural imagination, such as news reports, opinion pieces, dystopian fictions, and so on, all of which project to a not too distant future where human civilization collapses, or the world as we know it ends. Such future-oriented disaster begs comparison with the religious concept of apocalypse. And some sociological research points to a kind of climate millenarianism in certain Christian communities. Yet there is another concept, also drawn from the study of religion, relevant to the climate crisis, one that points us not towards the future, but rather the past. Today, Rosie will explore the utility of the concept fundamentalism in understanding the social effects of climate change. Whilst acknowledging its limitations as a descriptive category, scholarship on fundamentalism nonetheless identified a key fault line in 20th century society as a reaction against the destabilizing trends of modernity. In the 21st century, climate change is fast displacing modernity as the destabilizing force. Rosie considers what we can learn from fundamentalism about identifying emerging social fault lines and conflicts in the era of climate change. Rosie, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you for agreeing to give this presentation, which is titled Climate Fundamentalism, ?
Thanks very much, Milad. It's wonderful to have received the invitation to get a chance to talk this paper through. It was a great kind of encouragement to write it up properly. And it's interesting hearing the abstract read back to me, because it's you think, oh, that's what I thought how I thought the paper and the argument would go. And as I'll read through, you'll see that I am definitely talking about climate fundamentalisms, and that abstract does sort of reflect the paper, but it's a little bit different to how you might imagine. I too, also before I get started, want to just quickly acknowledge country. I'm working on Gadigal land, and I want to pay my respects to elders past and present. So let's get started. I will share a PowerPoint that I have. So the world as we know it is ending, if it hasn't ended already. In February this year, The Guardian reported that arborio and carnaroli rice harvests, which is the kind of rice used in risotto, may fail because of extended and devastating drought. The same newspaper, only a few days later, reported that the 2024 El Nino cycle is predicted to bring record-breaking heat in the first half of the year, after the same weather cycle smashed temperature records in 2023. In her 2017 book, Consuming Religion, Catherine Laughlin writes that the prerequisite of fundamentalism is, and I'm quoting from her here, not a certain level of modernity, but a certain psychology of chaos. It is a claim of a reinstated order after a named destabilization. What in our current moment is more destabilizing or more chaotic than climate change and its effects? This paper considers what we can learn from the field of religious studies about the new and old forms of reactionary groups that climate change may provoke. In the 20th century, scholars of religion from a variety of disciplinary backgrounds diagnosed a major social fault line, the fundamentalist response to the upheavals of modernity. For all its flaws, fundamentalism as a concept helped us to identify a cluster of groups that reacted against the changing social patterns of modernity and in some instances themselves threatened social stability. The primary destabilizing force in society will soon no longer be, I argue, modernity. Rather, climate change either will, or perhaps already has, eclipsed modernity in destabilizing our social world. What reactionary groups are forming? What risk are they to social stability or to efforts to mitigate climate change? In this paper, I explore what we can learn from fundamentalism research in the Anthropocene and consider whether climate change is simply one more symptom of modernity against which fundamentalist groups organize, or whether climate change brings with it a different kind of reactionary group. I'm going to begin with a brief overview of the literature on fundamentalism and its relationship to modernity before touching on how the concept of eco-fundamentalism has been discussed to date. I then sketch a range of possible reactions to climate change, which is based on existing studies. So the term fundamentalism first appeared in the United States in the early 20th century amongst Protestant Christians. Conflict had arisen between those Protestants seeking to reconcile Christianity to modern society and those who were militantly opposed to modernizing the Christian faith and militantly opposed to cultural changes endorsed by modernism. This latter group is known as the fundamentalists, so called because of the publication of the pamphlets titled The Fundamentals, which aimed to give a coherent summation of the entirety of Christian thought. After the Scopes trial in the 1920s, so-called fundamentalists disappeared from view somewhat, but they reappeared in force in the 1970s, most prominently with the Iranian Revolution, but also in the United States and in other contexts worldwide. Both public discourse and scholarship has historically emphasized fundamentalism as a reaction against modernity. Modernization, according to Laughlin, quote, refers to the simultaneous emergence of multiple new forms of social organization, of government and citizenship, of economic life and consumer choice, of educational institutions and the democratization of knowledge, of technological innovation and the popularization of science. In transforming social organizations so completely, some felt modernization threatened the identity and life of their, for example, Protestant Christian communities. An influential definition of fundamentalism by Armand et al. States that fundamentalism is first and foremost defense of a religious tradition, a tradition perceived to be eroding or under attack by the processes of modernization and secularization. The fundamentalist response to the massive social change brought about by modernity is an attempt to uphold or revive a valorized and idealized tradition. Yet the characterization of fundamentalism as being somehow in binary opposition to modernity fails to recognize that fundamentalist movements are themselves inherently modern. Fundamentalists are often savvy users of technology in promoting their movements and rely on modern concepts of self, nation, identity, and society in their definition of what they consider fundamental. J.S. Kruger notes that whilst staunchly opposing some aspects of modernity, fundamentalists also selectively incorporate other aspects of modern or postmodern culture. There has been significant disagreement among scholars about how the term fundamentalist can be applied, whether it can be accurately used outside the context of US Protestantism, and whether it can describe non-religious groups. Generally, the concept of fundamentalism has been applied to other non-US Protestant groups. Peel, for example, argues that the characteristics of fundamentalism are, quote, literalism and infallibilism about holy scriptures, an alleged clash with science, and traditional views on issues regarding gender and sexuality. He claims that movements or groups with these characteristics can be found in, for example, Islamic, Buddhist, and Hindu communities, as well as within Christianity. More controversial, however, is whether the term can be used to describe non-religious groups. So Almond et al. Give 9 characteristics of fundamentalism, the first of which is, quote, reactivity to the marginalization of religion, end quote. And they argue, quoting again, that without this characteristic, a movement is not properly labeled fundamentalist. This view is common amongst many influential scholars of fundamentalism. Peel, however, argues that fundamentalism can be found in apparently non-religious contexts, arguing for a family resemblance definition of fundamentalism that allows for the inclusion of non-religious groups, like neo-Nazis. Peel identifies that neo-Nazi groups provide a historical narrative in terms of an original paradisical state, a fall and a redemption story. Their views of gender and sexuality are rather traditional. They embrace some sort of cosmic dualism in which the free white world fights against the dangers of multiculturalism, and nowadays also identity politics. They embrace symbols and perform rituals to strengthen their ideals and identity, and have firm ideas about who is inside the group and who is outside. Peel suggests a definition that can capture non-religious fundamentalism as helpful because it allows scholars to consider the broader relationships and patterns between different types of reactionary groups and with modernity. For example, suggesting that religious and non-religious fundamentalism share the same traits of modernity, such as search for certainty and control in an uncertain world. And I think Peel's definition is helpful, and I use it a lot when I'm talking about climate fundamentalisms. The ongoing debates over the definition and scope of the term fundamentalism suggest that as a concept it's imprecise and unwieldy. However, as someone interested in social change, it's nonetheless helpful in identifying, however broadly, the ways in which some groups have responded to the social transformations brought about by processes of modernization. While not all fundamentalist groups are violent, some do resort to violent means in their efforts to protect their identity and way of life. Fundamentalism, thus, is both a reaction to destabilizing social change and sometimes also a cause of destabilization itself. Quite likely, the first serious treatment of something like climate fundamentalism came in 1995 with the publication of Lau's article, Eco-Fundamentalism. In that piece, Lau argued that proponents of global action on climate change were fundamentalists, pushing a religion-like ecological vision onto the world. Arguing both as a climate change skeptic and a modernist development scholar, he claimed that environmentalism was yet another way for Western countries to maintain their economic superiority over the global South. The implementation of tougher environmental standards on, for example, pollution, deforestation, and the protection of endangered species would hamper the competitive advantage of developing countries, whose chances of development, Lau assumes, relies upon exploitation of the environment and undercutting Western industry through looser environmental standards. Lau explicitly calls environmentalism a secular religious movement and argues that there are similarities between environmentalists and religious fundamentalists. So this quote here, though it may appear that the environmental movement is scientific and hence modern, while religious fundamentalists are non-scientific and pre-modern, they share a fear and contempt of the modernity whose central features are rightly seen to be an instrumental rationality which undermines humanity's traditional relationship with God or nature. The sense of loss felt by the ecologists in the face of modernity's disenchantment of the world is paralleled by the fundamentalists' fear of losing a cherished lifestyle. Lau's account, by claim, largely doesn't stand up to scrutiny some 30 years later. He's skeptical about climate science, saying, quote, "It's indubitable that these greenhouse gases have increased over the past 100 years and that emissions will accelerate with growing economic activity. What remains highly controversial is the purported link between this fact and the prospects of catastrophic climate change." End quote. The claim that climate scientists are believing something without sufficient evidence, a claim that environmentalism is therefore religious in character, I would argue can no longer be sustained in the contemporary world. Lau's claim that the environmental movement is anti-modern does, however, reflect some types of ecological activism, or at least some historical types of ecological activism. So Ida, in 1990, wrote of the environmental movement that it is trying to stall and even reverse what they regard as the self-defeating processes of modernization. Ida calls the exploitation of nature part of a global process of modernization and rationalization, and gives three alternatives to modernization: postmodernism, primitivism, and traditionalism. Where modernism decouples society from its cultural traditions and the natural world, postmodernism places positive emphasis on both nature and culture, while primitivism and traditionalism radicalize one or the other symbolic value. These alternatives to modernization are relevant to understanding how some groups are reacting against climate change destabilizations. Ida argues both primitivism and traditionalism aggravate the problems of modern society and thus are not viable alternatives. He argues only for postmodernism as a likely alternative to modernism. Both Lal and Ida's characterization as the environmental movement as anti-modern is, however, dated and now is possibly only true of some of the most radical elements. Since the 1990s, a kind of eco-modernism has gained dominance in the environmental policy responses of both mainstream environmental organizations and governments. Daggett contrasts the limits to growth mood of the 1970s, which Lal and Ida take as the environmental position, to eco-modernists' claim that, quote, there is no conflict between economic growth and environmental problems, and technological solutions, often private and market-based, would solve any difficulties. Modernization has successfully, for now, absorbed climate science and policy. Returning for a moment to Lal's argument, in sort of just a footnote that I can't help myself making, I think it's also a bit ethically dubious what he writes in that piece, because he describes a higher tolerance for pollution in developing nations as simply a, quote, matter of taste. He either ignores or is oblivious to the long-term impact of pollution on human bodies and ecologies, and the last 30 years of capitalist expansion suggest that most of the time, the benefits of looser environmental standards and exploitation concentrate in the hands of usually Western corporations, while the burdens, and ecological in particular, remain in the developing nation. So the accusation that environmentalism is religion-like does remain a popular trope amongst those who are opposed to action on the climate, and is used to undercut the validity of climate science and discredit climate action proponents. And it's worth pointing out, despite the fact that I disagree with most of what Lal says, he did identify something important, that conflict over the environment may be the new fault line and, quote, source of international friction in international relations. So, if fundamentalism has generally been conceptualized as groups responding to a tidal wave of modernity, quote, ripping apart communities, values, social ties, and meaning, that's from Emerson and Hartman, what role does climate change play in such groups? On the one hand, for some groups, the climate change paradigm, so the scientific evidence and discourse, policy and governance frameworks, and advocacy that has coalesced around and in response to climate change, is yet another aspect of modernity threatening the world as they know it. For such groups, opposition to climate change becomes another pillar around which to rally. However, climate change is fast overtaking modernization as the destabilizing force, with ever-increasing disruption to current forms of social organization. If fundamentalism was the reaction to modernity, what will the reaction to climate change be? It is possible that, like with fundamentalism and modernity, what Riesbrock calls personalistic patriarchal notions of order become attractive to people unsettled by climate change. But it's also possible that climate change gives rise to new types of reactionary groups. So I want to talk now a little bit about what I call new climate fundamentalists. So contemporary climate denialists are inheritors of a long tradition, and Kutney has traced the origins of science denialism back to conservative elements in the Catholic Church who were defending the authority of the Bible against people like Copernicus and Galileo and their theory of heliocentrism. You find it popping up again against Newton's work on gravity, and then again Darwin's work on evolution. In the case of climate science, however, it's not that science is undermining the authority of the church, but rather that science is undercutting business and corporate groups and sort of the ideology that has maintained their dominance. And it is, in fact, those groups who have aggressively promoted and funded climate denialism to protect their profit. So it's not church authority that's being threatened by climate science, but rather the ideology and structure of free market capitalism, and in particular, fossil fuel and extractive industries. A kind of new non-religious fundamentalism has arguably emerged, one led by the mostly white, mostly male business leaders in Anglo and European contexts. So, for example, Anshelm and Hultman studied climate denialists in Sweden and found a certain cluster, a very small group of highly influential industrialists who were at the center of the climate denial movement in Sweden. This new fundamentalism is promulgated by those who have benefited most from neoliberal capitalism and extractive industries, and idealizes an imagined mid to late 20th century era of economic growth and social conservatism, where consumption is unproblematic. They position themselves as, and I'm quoting here from Anshelm and Hultman, marginalized, banned, and oppressed dissidents, forced to speak up against a faith-based belief in climate science. Whilst they're not a religious group themselves, they do use religious metaphors to demean those who support climate science and action. And quoting from Anshelm and Hultman again, portraying scientists as priests, clerics, acolytes, fundamentalists, and so on, all with the intent of creating polarization and slowing change on the climate. Like previous forms of fundamentalism, gender appears to play a significant role in this new fundamentalism. Daggett has named the relationship between fossil fuels and white patriarchal orders petromasculinity. She argues that misogyny and climate denial are mutually constituted. She gives, as an example, Trump's 2016 presidential campaign to make America great again. She argues that it was, quote, an homage to a mid-20th century fantasy of American life when white men ruled their households uncontested, a formula that relied on widespread full-time employment for white men with wages that could support housewives and children, end quote. This kind of economy requires a fossil fuel industry, both to employ the men, but also to produce the consumer goods brought by the households that makes the economy profitable enough to pay the higher wages to the men in the first place. Climate science and the policy responses to climate change that seek to regulate and downsize the fossil fuel industry, along with other polluting industries, thus undermines the political economic system that gave rise to a particular type of masculinity, the male breadwinner. There is at least one other kind of climate fundamentalist evident in recent research, however, and that is the Christian, usually evangelical, climate skeptic. Like new climate fundamentalists, they too deny the validity of climate science. However, not because it undermines a particular economic ideology, but more akin to previous forms of fundamentalism, because it usurps God's authority. In her study of evangelical climate change skeptics in the United States, Valdman found that her participants viewed the claims that humans could impact the Earth's climate as, quote, an attempt to deny God's omnipotence. Like previous forms of religious fundamentalism, this religious climate fundamentalism is part of evangelicals' sense of embattlement with secular culture, and climate skepticism joined opposition to other so-called liberal issues such as LGBTQ rights and abortion access. This kind of religious climate fundamentalism is not limited to evangelical groups, it's worth pointing out. So politically conservative Catholics in the US, including prominent bishops, have undermined papal teaching about climate change and environmentalism, often through silence, while speaking out on other social issues. Yet in both evangelical and Catholic communities, climate skepticism is not an inherent or necessarily theological position, but rather is intimately entwined with conservative political influence. Valdman argues climate skepticism has been intentionally cultivated by leaders within the evangelical community who had close ties with conservative elements in the Republican Party. Their efforts, and I'm quoting from Valdman here, transformed climate skepticism and denial from a political opinion into an aspect of evangelical identity. This apparently more conventional religious climate fundamentalism is thus intimately interwoven with the new climate fundamentalism described previously. So both new fundamentalists and climate skeptic evangelicals are, I argue, fundamentalists. They both feel as though their communities, identities, and ways of life are threatened by climate science and policy. They're both highly conservative about gender, and they seek certainty and stability in an idealization of the past. Both groups also deny the validity of climate science and are skeptical about anthropogenic climate change. There are, however, other forms of climate fundamentalism that are not skeptical of climate science or anthropogenic climate change, and could even be considered pro-environmental, depending on how you define environmentalism. Recent studies of European populism in the far right note that few far-right political parties deny the reality of climate change. Indeed, the link between land and people found in nationalism results in an at least ideological affinity between the far right and environmental protection. In fact, a study of far-right parties in the European Parliament found the more extreme a far-right party, the more ecologically minded they were. Although they accept the reality of climate change, far-right parties are skeptical of many typical policy and governance responses to the climate crisis. They claim that the new institutions required to mitigate or adapt to climate change will undermine state sovereignty, and that the economy should not be harmed in the adaptation or mitigation efforts. Yet this acceptance of climate change, albeit with skepticism about the policy response, is accompanied by control of female sexuality, bodies, and reproduction, and an aversion to globalization and multiculturalism and anti-immigrant sentiments, which fuel a desire to recover the lost greatness of a nation in decline. Like other climate fundamentalists, therefore, far-right populists also look for certainty and stability in the past. Their anti-immigrant, anti-multicultural stance also threatens social stability in the near future. Whilst climate change discourse amongst the far right does not yet overlap with their immigration discourse, this will almost certainly change as climate-related migration increases. So I want to turn now away from the idea of fundamentalism to consider new reactionary trends in the Anthropocene. So where the previous section identified how groups with at least a resemblance to fundamentalism, so having a threatened social identity, seeking stability in an idealization of a particular past, are emerging in response to climate change, this section explores whether climate change will prompt new reactionary groups that are unlike fundamentalism in some way or another. Research on fundamentalism, however imprecise, was able to identify at least some common characteristics and, importantly, name the reactionary dynamic against modernity from which fundamentalist groups arose. So what will be the dynamic of reaction against climate change? One feature of climate change reactionaries appears to be looking for stability and certitude in an idealization of the future rather than the past. This is a temporal shift in relation to fundamentalism. So Fagan writes that apocalyptic time is directed towards a certain event with an acceleration of time towards a prophesied end. So the trope that time is running out on climate change, that we are approaching a tipping point and must act now, evoke precisely the sense of acceleration, time compression, and urgency. There's a great deal of work already from scholars of religion on the relationship between climate change and millenarianism, for example, or other types of apocalypticism. But much of it actually objects to the use of apocalyptic narratives in climate change discourse, focusing on mainstream media discourse rather than marginal reactionary groups. In 2013, Religion and Society, the journal, dedicated 28 pages to a debate or a roundtable discussion about narratives of apocalypse in climate change discourse, with contributions from a wide variety of quite well-known scholars in this area. The debate focused on the use of apocalypse as a metaphor for climate change, along with other ways in which climate change discourse makes use of religious concepts or language. So, for example, the way that the skeptics we were just talking about call the climate change paradigm a religion. Speaking of the way in which climate scientists are sometimes labeled prophets, and arguing for an understanding of prophecy that, quote, has more to do with contesting moral and political corruption in the present, end quote, Scrimshaw writes, Scientific predictions do not replace the social roles of prophecy or apocalypticism, because those roles had more to do with the transformation or renewal of political and moral orientation than the art of future telling. These are roles that the sciences are unwarrantedly called upon today to fulfill the void of any prophetic voices of radical political critique operating at the policy level today. Fagan, meanwhile, argues that the future imaginaries of apocalypse, so prevalent in climate discourse across not only popular culture but also politics, reproduces individualistic, non-relational accounts of subjectivity and ultimately fails to motivate action. So as you can see, they're all kind of opposed to using this idea of apocalypse. Swinjdow as well, among others, notes the contradictions inherent to apocalyptic discourses. Whilst they prophesy the end of the world, they're also used in some forms of politics to maintain a status quo. So here, reference to a kind of eco-modernism is at play. So the idea that a scientific technical fix which leaves capitalism untouched. And a quote from Swinjdow on that: "We have to change radically, but within the contours of the existing state of affairs, so that nothing really has to change." Like Fagan, Swinjdow notes that apocalypse does not motivate action because it's a future that few really believe will realize itself. There are, however, a few studies of what we might call reactionary climate change groups and who are apocalyptic or millenarian in form. So Webster's study of, Webster examined how Christians skeptical of global warming living in a remote Scottish fishing village imagined they were living in the last days, documenting how they interpreted material and political signs like sustainable fishing regulations from the EU and climate science summits as evidence of the closeness of the devil. It was not climate change itself that was the sign of impending apocalypse, but rather the effort of scientists and policymakers to regulate environmental harm that was the sign, not of climate apocalypse, but of the coming of the devil. Scrimshire in 2019 returned to apocalypse to argue that millenarianism might be reclaimed for an age of climate emergency. He argues that millenarianism as a particular kind of orientation toward apocalypse clearly does not allow silence or indifference in the face of current political events, and that, quote, "the eschaton represents a hoped-for state of peace after conflict in history, including the present." Perhaps importantly for millenarianisms, the apocalypse is not the end of time or history, but rather, and quoting from Scrimshire here, the end of a certain time within the world. Climate crisis does not signal the end of the world, but the end of the world as we know it, something other groups, Indigenous people, for example, have already experienced. So there's similarity beyond the use of just sort of religious concepts and language to the apocalypse and fundamentalism distinction. In his disambiguation of apocalypse, eschatology, and the varieties of sort of millennial and millenarian, Scrimshaw notes that what millenarians unanimously oppose is the legitimacy of the present age. And I think the same can sort of be said of fundamentalists. Millenarian belief is as much about the turning of a revolutionary cycle and the ushering in of a new political order. What Scrimshaw leaves unsaid, but which is implied in millenarian thought, is that this new political order is imagined as new, and this is a key difference. It's not a return to an imagined historical time, but the coming of a prophesied new order. So I just have some concluding thoughts at this point. And my conclusions are a bit sketchy and fairly brief. So there's lots for us to kind of pick apart here. So I would claim that fundamentalism is still at the moment the dominant form of reaction against the chaos of climate change. This is, I would argue, because modernism has successfully contained climate science and sort of the climate change paradigm in a kind of eco-modernism. So because we're still operating in a modernist system, the reaction is fundamentalist in kind. But I think it is likely that the status quo will not last. Climate change is at some unknown point going to burst out of the control of modernism. The question in my mind is what kind of reactionary groups emerge at that point. There is, I think, good reason to assume a change in the temporal orientation of reactionary groups, so that they are less about imagining a return to an idealized past. And I think this because the past is going to become a land, and I do mean land in the physical sense, that can never be returned to because of climate change. So in that context, I think looking to the future, there's a logic to looking to the future to try and make sense of the uncertainty and chaos of climate change. And at that point, I'm going to stop early. Thank you very much.